You were never supposed to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was meant to stay buried in the archives of Sangamon County, smothered in dust, sealed by silence, and forgotten by the bloodlines that carried the shame. But history has a way of clawing itself back from the grave, and tonight, it comes for you. Summer, 1812. A hidden institution along the Sangamon River in the Illinois Territory, a place built under the noble banner of charity. Riverside Children's Home. A fortress of limestone meant to shelter the lost and the broken. Those children stripped of parents by disease, war, and frontier violence. It was supposed to be a refuge. Instead, it became an altar of suffering. 95 children entered that summer. By the end of it, 83 lay in the ground. Understand this. They did not die by plague, nor fire, nor famine. The official records could not explain it. But the bodies told their story: brittle bones, hollowed eyes, scars that spoke of torment. And one phrase, written in the trembling hand of a county magistrate who fled his post in terror, remains the only honest testimony. Methods employed beyond Christian comprehension. For nearly 2 centuries, the story was erased. Clergy sealed the files. Politicians denied it ever happened. Families were forbidden to speak the names of their dead. Because the truth was never about disease. It was never about tragedy. It was about design. At the center stood a man, Josiah Crane, a veteran of the frontier wars, a man who limped from old wounds but walked with the authority of command. To the outside world, he was a savior, stepping forward when no one else would shoulder the burden of caring for the orphans. But inside those stone walls, he was more than a caretaker. He was an architect, a theorist, a man convinced that suffering was not cruelty, but salvation. And to prove it, he used children as his raw material. What was created inside Riverside was not charity. It did not care. It was a laboratory of discipline and deprivation. Crane believed he was forging stronger humans, but what he truly revealed was how institutions, cloaked in righteousness, can become engines of destruction. And if you think this was an isolated horror, you're already blind. What happened at Riverside was not just a tragedy. It was a prototype. The winter before the deaths began was the coldest anyone in Illinois Territory had ever survived. Historians call it the year without a summer. Crops failed. Livestock froze to the bone inside barns that should have kept them safe. Families watched their children starve by fires that could no longer warm them. Survival stripped the frontier of illusions, leaving only the raw arithmetic of life and death. It was into this frozen crucible that Josiah Crane stepped forward, presenting himself as the only man capable of leading the Riverside home after the sudden death of its gentle founder, Mrs. Hartwell. She had treated the children with care, with warmth, with the faint echo of love. Crane despised her for it, even though she was already dead. To him, her compassion was weakness, a disease he intended to cure. From the moment Crane arrived, everything shifted. The children felt it in their bones before they understood it with their minds. Their meals cut in half, their blankets confiscated, their games replaced with what he called readiness drills. They stood outside barefoot in the snow until their tears froze on their cheeks. And when one collapsed, Crane did not comfort them. He turned to the others and hissed, "Remember this. The world beyond these walls will not save you. Only your own strength will." What Crane preached was not care. It was a philosophy. He believed that every ounce of suffering purified the child, burned out weakness, carved resilience into the marrow. And yet, he kept meticulous notes: every cough, every shiver, every fainting body recorded with the precision of a military scientist. To him, this was not cruelty. This was data. But listen carefully, because this is where the illusion cracks. The authorities knew. The Illinois Territorial Charitable Society, the very body that placed Crane in power, received letters. Reports of children collapsing in the snow. Whispers from surviving orphans smuggled through settlers who visited with food. But those letters never reached the public. They were filed away, sealed under wax, dismissed as exaggerations. Why? Because institutions prefer order over truth. A scandal would collapse public trust in the very idea of charity. Better to bury a few voices. Better to let silence cover the screams. And so the experiment continued. Children were starved, frozen, broken all under the authority of men in warm rooms, men who called themselves benefactors. What Crane unleashed at Riverside was not born from madness alone. It was enabled, permitted, sanctioned. The first child to die was 6 years old. His name was Thomas Brennan, though history nearly erased him to nothing but an entry in Crane's logbook. Subject T. Brennan. Failure of will. It was January 8, 1812. The snow lay thick across the Sangamon Prairie, and the children had been forced into the courtyard for another of Crane's cold-tolerance drills. Barefoot, thin shirts, the kind of exposure that would cripple grown men. Thomas was already coughing, his small frame shaking with fever. He begged to be excused. Crane denied him. Weakness, he said, was the greatest sin of all. For nearly an hour the children stood, their skin raw with frost. One by one they swayed, but Thomas was the first to fall. He crumpled into the snow, his lips blue, his breathing shallow. The other children gasped, some moving toward him. But Crane raised his cane and barked a command. Leave him. This is his test. Do not interfere with fate. They obeyed because they were afraid. Afraid of punishment, afraid of failing their own so-called test. It was Mary Patterson, a 14-year-old, who broke ranks. She rushed forward, shaking Thomas, screaming his name. Only then did Crane step in, lifting the boy's body as though lifting evidence, not a child. Hours later, Thomas was dead. His temperature had fallen so low the crude thermometer could not even measure it. That night, Crane gathered the survivors. He told them Thomas had not died from cold, but from weakness. He told them their grief was proof of the same disease. His exact words are recorded in the testimony of Mary Patterson decades later. You will not weep, you will not pity, you will harden, or you will join him. And here lies the most chilling truth. The children believed him. Imagine being a child, already orphaned, already stripped of family, and now told by the one authority in your world that your only chance of survival was obedience to pain. This is how control is forged. Not through kindness, not through comfort, but through the systematic breaking of will until silence feels like safety. Thomas Brennan became the first offering to Crane's philosophy. But he would not be the last. His death did not slow the regime. It accelerated it. Crane looked into the frightened faces of those children and saw proof, not failure. To him, Thomas's death was confirmation that the system was working. That night, in his journal, he wrote one sentence that would echo like a curse across the entire summer. The weak fall, the strong remain. By February of 1812, Crane no longer pretended this was charity. He had built a machine and the children were its fuel. His logs, still preserved in brittle pages discovered in 1987, show a meticulous architecture of torment. He called it the Frontier Readiness Protocol. For phases, each more severe than the last. Phase 1 was deprivation. Half meals, no blankets, endless hours in the cold. By now, the children's cheeks were sunken, their ribs showing through their shirts. They shuffled through the halls like shadows of their former selves. But Crane looked at them and saw progress. Less crying, fewer complaints. Signs of discipline, he wrote. Phase 2 began in February, just as the winter reached its cruelest edge. Hunger was no longer enough. Now came labor. Children as young as 5 dragged buckets from the frozen river, scrubbed stone floors with bare hands in freezing water, chopped wood until blisters opened and bled. To Crane, this was not punishment. It was purification. Work, he believed, was the fire that burned weakness into strength. And if a child faltered, Crane had a new method: isolation strengthening. A phrase that sounds clinical until you understand what it meant. The root cellar beneath Riverside was dark, damp, and cold enough to freeze meat. There, children were locked alone for days, no light, no warmth, barely enough food to keep their hearts beating. Some emerged with frostbitten fingers. Some emerged in silence that never broke again. Emma Caldwell was 9 years old. She had shared her bread crust with a crying younger child. Crane called it encouraging weakness and sent her below. For days later she returned, her lips cracked, her eyes vacant. Mary Patterson said she came back missing something inside. Her laughter, her warmth gone. And that was the point. Crane didn't just want obedience. He wanted to strip the children of self, to hollow them until they could be filled with his doctrine. And the institution let him. Think about that. The Illinois Territorial Charitable Society received reports. They knew children were vanishing into silence. But the gears of bureaucracy turned, and the machine continued. Because to shut it down would be to admit complicity. The second death came that same month. Martin Kowalski, age 11, collapsed hauling water through the snow. His body was weak from fever. Crane ordered the children to keep working as he dragged Martin's limp form inside. Hours later, Martin joined Thomas Brennan in the earth. Crane's journal that night? 2 words. Progress noted. By March of 1812, Riverside was no longer a home. It was a camp, a fortress of obedience carved out of stone and silence. The children no longer resisted openly. They no longer begged for warmth or food or rest. Instead, they turned their eyes downward and swallowed their cries. Not because they had grown stronger but because fear had hollowed them. This is how psychological control takes root. Not in the shouts of rebellion, but in the quiet surrender of spirit. Crane understood this. Every lash of cold, every pang of hunger, every sleepless night was not just punishment, it was training. Breaking them down, rebuilding them in his image. By spring, the deaths began to multiply. 1 child every few weeks. Malnutrition, infection, collapse during labor. Each loss was reframed, not as tragedy, but as proof. Crane gathered the survivors after every burial and told them the same words. The weak fall, so the strong may rise. Over and over like a scripture. And here is the darkest twist: the children began to repeat it. They whispered it in their dormitories, too afraid to say anything else. When another child collapsed in the courtyard, some did not run to help. They stood, trembling, whispering Crane's mantra as if saying it might shield them from the same fate. This is how an ideology metastasizes. Not through persuasion, but through survival. When your life depends on obedience, lies begin to feel like truth. But there were cracks. Mary Patterson, older than most, kept her mind sharper than Crane realized. She recorded fragments in scraps of cloth, in etchings on the dormitory wall. She later testified that by March, the children no longer cried when one of their number died. They watched in silence. They prayed for it not to be them. That silence was worse than the death itself, because it proved Crane's system was working. Institutional eyes still looked away. Reports were filed. Warnings whispered, yet every official preferred silence to scandal. It was easier to let the children vanish than to admit the benevolent society had placed them in the hands of a zealot. By the time the thaw came to Illinois, Riverside had become something more than an orphanage. It was a proving ground, a hidden ritual of suffering that stripped 95 children of everything: body, mind, spirit. And still, Crane wrote in his journal with calm precision. The experiment proceeds, endurance increasing, fear transforming into discipline. The children weren't just dying. They were being reprogrammed. By April, the frost was breaking, but Riverside only grew colder. Not in temperature, in spirit. Because this was the beginning of Crane's third phase, loyalty through terror. He knew starvation alone would not keep them forever. Hunger weakens, cold kills. But to forge true obedience, he needed something deeper, a system that would turn the children against themselves. It began with the watch. Crane appointed the older children to oversee the younger ones. If a child cried out in the night, the watch was to report it. If anyone disobeyed an order, even in whispers, the watch was required to expose them. Failure to do so meant punishment, not just for the guilty child but for the one who kept silent. This was not discipline. This was psychological warfare. Imagine being 10 years old, starving, terrified, and now forced to betray your only friend to protect yourself. Some children broke immediately, racing to inform on others to prove loyalty. Others tried to shield their companions, but every attempt ended in punishment that spread like infection. Mary Patterson later said, "We stopped being friends. We became enemies wearing the faces of children." The cellar filled more frequently now, not just with those who defied Crane, but with those who remained silent. Solidarity itself was a crime, and Crane twisted their fear into worship. He began addressing them not as children, but as initiates. He told them they were chosen, stripped of weakness by fire and frost. He promised that if they endured, they would become something greater, new beings, carved from suffering. The words echo eerily like the sermons of cult leaders that would come more than a century later. The children began to repeat his language. They no longer spoke of food or warmth, but of tests. They no longer asked when the cruelty would end. They asked if they were strong enough to survive the next trial. This is how a prison becomes a church, how abuse becomes doctrine. And with every death, the survivors believed more deeply. Crane told them that those who perished had been found unworthy, and in their fear, the children agreed. They convinced themselves it was better to endure, better to obey, than to join the fallen. By May, the institution was no longer a home for orphans. It was a cult of suffering with Josiah Crane as its prophet. And outside, the society that placed him there looked away, their silence cementing his power. But what Crane had created at Riverside was not just about control of children. It was a reflection of something larger, the way institutions, cloaked in righteousness, feed on silence and obedience to grow stronger. And it begs a question. How many more Cranes have existed, hidden behind walls and paperwork, while the world looked the other way? By the summer of 1812, death was no longer an interruption at Riverside. It was the rhythm of life. Every week, another child collapsed. Some from hunger, some from infection, some from injuries that no one treated. And yet, Crane stood over each body as though it were proof of revelation. The fields outside were greening. Farmers across Illinois were planting what little crop they could salvage after the brutal winter. Life was returning to the land. But inside the limestone walls of Riverside, the children were sinking into shadows. Skin stretched over bone, eyes hollow and glassy, their voices reduced to whispers. And still, Crane called them initiates. He told them they were becoming something new, that each death was not loss but refinement, the fire that burns away the weak. It was here that his doctrine took its most dangerous turn. He began calling the death sacrifices, not accidents, not failures, sacrifices, offerings to the ideal of strength. And when another child died, he did not allow mourning. He gathered the survivors in the courtyard, forced them to stand over the freshly dug grave, and repeat his words, "The weak fall, the strong remain," over and over until their voices were hoarse, until they believed it. Mary Patterson recalled one burial where a boy no older than 8 was lowered into the earth. Crane turned to the others and declared, "He chose weakness. You will not." And the children, trembling, repeated after him, some with tears frozen on their cheeks, some with blank, lifeless eyes, but all obeyed. This is the nature of psychological capture. When the mind is starved, when the body is broken, when every choice is reduced to obedience or death, the doctrine no longer feels imposed. It begins to feel natural. Crane had reshaped their reality. He was no longer just a caretaker or even a tyrant. He was their world. And still, the outside society remained silent. Letters describing starvation and abuse were buried in drawers. Reports of excessive severity were dismissed as exaggerations. The institution carried on, hidden in plain sight, because scandal was a greater threat than truth. By midsummer, 95 children had been reduced to 12 survivors. 12 hollow shells clinging to life inside a home that had become a graveyard. Crane called them his chosen, his proof that suffering could forge the unbreakable. But there is something deeper here, something you must not ignore. Riverside was not just an orphanage gone wrong. It was a blueprint, a demonstration of how institutions cloak cruelty in noble words, how children become pawns in experiments disguised as care, and how silence from those who should have stopped it becomes the sharpest weapon of all. And now I will ask you something dangerous. If you are still listening, if you feel the weight of this truth pressing into your chest, I need you to write one phrase in the comments below. Write it twice so it burns into you and so the algorithm cannot bury this story. The phrase is this: the silence feeds the machine. Write it once to remember. Write it again to awaken. Because once you see how silence sustains power, you cannot unsee it. By August of 1812, Riverside was a tomb disguised as a home. 95 children had been reduced to fewer than a dozen survivors. Their bodies brittle as twigs, their spirits nearly erased. They no longer resisted, no longer cried. They moved like sleepwalkers through Crane's commands, obeying not from fear but from something worse, the absence of self. And then, finally, the silence cracked. A visiting physician, sent under the guise of routine inspection, stumbled into the reality that had been buried for months. He expected a school of children. What he found were corpses in shallow graves, wasted survivors staring with glassy eyes, and a director whose journal spoke of sacrifice as if it were scripture. The physician's report should have brought the institution crashing down overnight. Instead, it was met with delay, debate, hesitation. Officials argued over wording. Politicians feared scandal. The society that had funded Riverside whispered about damage control. Even in the face of undeniable horror, the instinct for preservation outweighed the instinct for justice. But word leaked. Parents of the dead, poor, powerless, long dismissed, began to speak. Local whispers grew into outcry. By autumn, the truth could no longer be contained. Riverside's gates were closed, its name stricken from records. And Josiah Crane? When the sheriff's men came for him, the dormitories were empty, his office abandoned, his journals half-burned in the hearth. Crane had vanished. Some claimed he fled west, carrying his doctrine to some other desperate frontier. Others swore he disappeared into the woods, a ghost of his own making. What is certain is this: he was never tried, never punished, never forced to account for the lives he extinguished. The surviving children, what few there were scattered into other homes. Some lived long enough to testify years later. Their accounts are fragmented, like broken mirrors. One wrote, "I still hear him. When the wind cuts at my face, I hear him say the words, 'The weak fall, the strong remain.'" Another confessed she could not sleep without standing to attention, waiting for inspection that never came. Riverside's ruins rotted into the earth, but the story remains. Not because of official histories those tried to erase it, but because survivors carried it in whispers. Because local folklore kept the name alive. And because silence, once it is recognized, can be broken. Here is the final, unbearable truth. Crane's experiment did not die with Riverside. It was not the last of its kind. It was only one chapter in a longer book, written in different places, by different hands, always wrapped in the language of care, discipline, or faith. Which means the real question is not what happened to the children of Riverside. The real question is this: how many other Riversides still exist hidden behind walls, disguised as mercy, protected by silence? You've heard the story now. You've walked through the halls of Riverside, felt the stone walls close in, heard the voices of children ground down to whispers. You've seen how an institution, cloaked in charity, became a machine of suffering. But the most terrifying part is not the past. It is the pattern. Because Riverside is not alone. History repeats itself: different names, different uniforms, different banners of righteousness. Orphanages, asylums, reform schools, places where those with no power are locked away, and those with authority are told they answer to no one. And every time, silence is the accomplice. So when you turn off this video, do not think you've escaped the story. Ask yourself instead, what walls stand in your own city? What buildings hold people who cannot speak for themselves? And who benefits from your silence? The children of Riverside do not speak anymore. But their graves remain. Their story remains. And now it is inside you. If you feel the weight of it, don't let it fade. Break the silence they could not break. Share the story. Speak their names. And most of all, remember the phrase I gave you, the one that still rings like a curse against power. The silence feeds the machine. Whisper it. Write it. Carry it. Because if enough of us say it, the machine begins to starve. And maybe, just maybe, history will not be allowed to repeat. If you've made it this far, you're now part of this story. To prove you've heard the voices of Riverside, write in the comments. The silence feeds the machine. Not once, twice. That way, YouTube cannot bury their memory. I want you to do something for me. Take a second, pause, and whisper this out loud. The silence feeds the machine. If it gave you chills, then you understand why I had to tell this story. Now share it, because silence is how history repeats itself. Now I want to hear from you. Imagine being one of the last 12 children. Would you have survived? Or would you have been one of the forgotten? Write your answer below and read what others are saying. Together, let's break the silence they couldn't. If you felt the weight of Riverside's story, don't let it vanish into the void. If you felt the weight of Riverside's story, don't let it vanish into the void. Comment, share, and subscribe, not for me, but for them. Every interaction keeps their voices alive and ensures their silence doesn't happen again.